A father learns to spot danger with his eyes closed. But the one threat he never trains for is the one that walks through the front door every evening wearing a wedding ring and calling itself family. For 9 years, I told myself I was doing right by my daughter Rachel, by staying quiet and staying out of the way. I told myself that was what a good father-in-law does. I didn't understand that my silence was the very thing keeping her buried. Welcome back to the channel. If you believe a father's job never really ends, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It means more than you know. My daughter, Rachel, was 26 when the accident happened. Before that, she was the kind of girl who couldn't finish a phone call without laughing at her own joke halfway through it. She taught third grade at Millbrook Elementary outside of Asheville, North Carolina, graded papers at my kitchen table every Sunday because she said my house smelled like coffee and made her think clearer, and she ran 3 miles every morning along the greenway before school, rain or shine. She was the kind of daughter who'd show up unannounced with a casserole dish just because she thought I looked tired on the phone the day before. When the car she was riding in went off Blue Ridge Parkway during an ice storm 8 years ago, the doctors at Mission Hospital told us the damage to her spine was catastrophic. They used words like incomplete and unlikely. And I didn't understand half of what they meant, only that my little girl might never walk again. She didn't cry when they told her. She looked over at me standing in the doorway of her hospital room, saw my face crumbling, and said, "Don't you dare fall apart on me, Dad. I need you standing." That was Rachel. Even flat on her back in a hospital bed, she was still trying to hold the rest of us together. My name is Walter Coleman. I'm 64 years old, a retired fire captain, and for 8 years my greatest failure wasn't the accident. It was what I let happen after it. I wasn't in the car that night. Her husband, Derek, was driving, and he walked away with a broken collarbone while Rachel lost the use of her legs. I never blamed Derek for the ice on the road. Nobody could have seen that patch coming. But somewhere along the way, my guilt at not being able to protect my own child turned into a kind of surrender. I handed Derek control of everything: the insurance settlement of $1.4 million, the medical decisions, the day-to-day running of their household on Chestnut Ridge Road. I signed whatever forms he put in front of me. I paid for the specialized recliner that never seemed to get delivered. I paid for aquatic therapy sessions at a facility 40 minutes away that Rachel said she was too tired to attend more than twice. I told myself he was her husband, that it wasn't my place to interfere, that my job was to show up on weekends and stay quiet the rest of the time. The cracks started showing on a Wednesday morning in early November. At 6:50 a.m., Derek came down the stairs of their house dragging a hard-shell suitcase, dressed in a gray fleece vest with his company's logo stitched over the chest. He was holding his phone in one hand and a travel mug in the other, already scrolling through something as he walked. He didn't glance toward the living room, where Rachel sat in her wheelchair near the bay window, watching the fog sitting low over the ridge outside. "I've got the regional sales training in Charlotte," Derek said, setting his suitcase by the front door without looking at either of us. "I'll be back Saturday afternoon. Walter, her infusion nurse, is coming at 11 to hook up the new IV bag. Just let her in, sign the clipboard. Don't ask her a bunch of questions. She's on a schedule. And make sure Rachel takes her afternoon dose on time. She gets combative if she misses it." Rachel didn't turn her head. She kept looking out at the fog, her hands resting still in her lap. "Drive safe," I said, from where I stood by the kitchen counter, wiping down a mug that didn't need wiping. "Keep the thermostat at 70, Derek added, shrugging into his coat. "The billing on this house is already a nightmare. I don't need the propane company calling me again." He grabbed his keys off the hook, pulled the front door shut behind him without another word, and a minute later I heard his SUV crunch down the gravel driveway and disappear onto the main road. Our neighbor, Miss Odell, came by about 25 minutes later. She's a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher who lives 2 houses down and smells faintly of lavender and printer ink from decades of grading papers. She came up the porch steps carrying a covered dish of chicken and dumplings her late husband used to love, the same recipe she'd been bringing us every other week since the accident. Miss Odell never had much good to say about Derek, though she was too polite a woman to ever put it plainly. Whenever he talked over Rachel or waved off a question like it was a nuisance, I'd watch Miss Odell's mouth go tight at the corners. Back in the spring, when the wheelchair ramp at the side door started splitting from water damage, Derek spent nearly 2 weeks saying he'd get to it, until Miss Odell's grandson came by one Saturday with a truck full of pressure-treated lumber and rebuilt the whole thing in an afternoon, refusing so much as a $20 bill for his trouble. Miss Odell set the dish down on the counter, gave me a small nod, and looked over at Rachel. "Morning, sweetheart. You sleep all right?" "I slept fine, Miss Odell. Thank you for the dumplings," Rachel said, her voice soft, a little slower than I remembered it being years ago. Miss Odell squeezed my forearm on her way out. "You call me if you need anything while he's off gallivanting, Walter." Then she let herself out through the side door. It was 7:40 in the morning. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and started rinsing the breakfast dishes in the sink, my back to the living room. That's when I heard it, not the low electric whir of Rachel's wheelchair motor, but something else. A slow, careful shuffling sound, footsteps dragging faintly against hardwood. I turned around, still holding a wet plate, and there she was, standing in the archway between the living room and the kitchen. Not in her chair, upright, her right hand braced hard against the doorframe, her whole body trembling with the effort of holding herself up, sweat already beading along her hairline even though the house was cool. But she was standing. Her feet were flat on the floor. The plate slipped out of my hands and cracked against the edge of the sink. "Rachel," I said, my voice barely making it out of my throat. "Rachel, honey, how are you standing?" She took one shuffling step forward, gripping the back of a dining chair, then lowered herself into it slowly, breathing hard through her nose. "Sit down, Dad," she said. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It had gone flat and steady, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. "There's not much time before the nurse gets here." I dropped into the chair across from her, my pulse hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been able to do that?" 14 months, Rachel said. I just stared at her. The word didn't fit anywhere in my head. 14 months? Rachel, we sat in that hospital. The specialist told us the injury was incomplete, that there was a chance. But you've been in that chair for 8 years. Why wouldn't you tell us? "Because I didn't understand what was happening to me at first," she said, her jaw tightening. The feeling started coming back into my left leg almost 2 years ago. Just pins and needles at night. Nothing I could explain to anyone without sounding crazy. I started doing exercises alone in the bathroom when Derek was at work, holding onto the towel bar. 6 months ago, I could stand for almost a full minute. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted us to celebrate it together. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and she pressed her lips together until it passed. She reached down beside her chair and pulled up a canvas tote bag I hadn't even noticed she was carrying, and dropped it onto the table between us with a heavy thud. 2 months ago, I found something in his home office. He'd left his laptop open while he showered. She unzipped the bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it toward me across the table. On top was a printed billing statement from an infusion clinic in Charlotte I had never once heard mentioned. "What is this?" I asked, my hand shaking as I lifted the page. "That's an invoice for a compound called dextromethorphan baclofen infusion," Rachel said quietly. "It's not FDA approved for what he's been telling that traveling nurse it's for. It's a muscle relaxant cocktail, way outside any dose a real doctor would prescribe for spasticity. It's been going into my IV bag every single week for almost 3 years, Dad, not to help me heal. To keep my legs weak and my head slow enough that I wouldn't notice what he was doing with the rest of it." I looked down at the rest of the papers in the folder, more invoices, a photocopy of a check, a printout of an email chain. "The rest of what?" I asked, though some cold, sinking part of me already knew. Rachel pulled a highlighted page free and turned it to face me. "This is the disbursement schedule for the settlement trust. As long as I'm certified permanently disabled and requiring full-time in-home care, Derek receives $11,000 a month as my designated caregiver, tax-free, straight out of the trust, plus full control of the housing account. If I recover, if I can walk, work, take care of myself, the trust reverts to my name, and his stipend ends the day a doctor signs off on it." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen since before the accident. Pure, cold clarity. "He didn't want me dead, Dad. He just needed me sick. Sick enough to need him, quiet enough not to ask questions, for as long as he could stretch it out." I sat there at that table while the kitchen clock ticked past 8 o'clock, and I felt 8 years of guilt curdle into something else entirely. I had blamed myself for staying out of their marriage. I had told myself I was respecting their privacy by never once asking to see the trust paperwork. I had paid for a recliner that never arrived, and therapy sessions that never happened, and told myself I was being a good father by not making waves. "How did you get off it?" I asked. "The infusions. 3 weeks ago, I started asking the nurse to let me hold my own IV line during the flush. Told her I wanted to feel useful." Rachel said, "I've been diverting half the dose into a specimen cup and dumping it before she comes back in the room. Within a week, my head started clearing up in a way I hadn't felt in years. I've been standing every single night after he falls asleep, holding onto the bed frame, building it back up little by little." She reached into the tote bag again and pulled out a small silver flash drive, setting it on top of the folder. "He's not in Charlotte for sales training, Dad. He's in Highlands. He put a deposit down on a cabin up there 4 months ago, financed partly with $160,000. He pulled out of my trust account using a POA amendment with a signature that isn't mine. He's meeting the seller's agent at 11 o'clock this morning to close on it." She looked at me steady across that table. "I can't drive myself yet. My legs won't hold a clutch, and I don't trust my reflexes on the highway. I need you to take me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. Something in my chest just went quiet and hard, the way it used to right before I'd walk into a burning structure, all the fear burning off and leaving only the job in front of me. "Get your coat," I said. Before we left the house, I walked into the small den off the kitchen and called my cousin Marcus, who'd spent 30 years as an attorney in Asheville before he semi-retired to handle a smaller caseload. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter, everything all right?" "Marcus, I need you to pull the original settlement trust paperwork for Rachel today, and I need you to meet us at the Buncombe County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit at noon. Bring a notary if you can get one on short notice." "Walter, what's going on?" "My daughter's walking," I said, my voice steady even though my hands weren't. "And her husband's about to close on a cabin with money he stole from her." At 8:35 that morning, we walked out onto the porch together. Rachel took the ramp down on her own 2 feet, one hand gripping the rail Miss Odell's grandson had built, taking her time, her jaw set with effort on every step. But she didn't stop, and she didn't ask for my arm. She eased herself into the passenger seat of my truck, and I came around and got behind the wheel. We took Highway 64 out toward Highlands, the mountains still holding on to their last color before winter stripped the ridgelines bare. Rachel stayed quiet for most of the drive, watching the switchbacks climb higher, her hands folded in her lap. "You don't have to feel guilty about this anymore, Dad," she said finally, as we passed the turnoff for cashiers. "You didn't do this to me. I know you think you should have asked more questions, but I'm the one who let him convince me I couldn't trust my own instincts. I should have looked harder," I said, both hands on the wheel. I told myself staying quiet was respect. It wasn't. It was easier. "I know now," she said. "We both know now." We reached the real estate office in Highlands, a little after 10:45, a stone front building set just off Main Street, with the mountains rising up behind it through the front windows. I parked 2 spaces down from Derek's SUV. Through the glass, we could see him seated at a round table with a closing agent and an older man in a plaid shirt, papers spread out between them. Derek leaning back in his chair with the easy posture of a man who thought the hard part was already behind him. If any of this is hitting close to home, if you've ever watched someone in your own family get taken advantage of by a person who was supposed to love them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. It really does help these stories reach the people who need to hear them. We walked through the front door together a few minutes before 11. A little brass bell chimed above us. The receptionist looked up with a pleasant smile. "Good morning, folks. Are you here for a showing?" "We're here for the closing at that table," I said quietly, nodding toward the back. Derek heard my voice before he saw us. He turned in his chair, already halfway into a smile, expecting maybe a courier or a late guest, and then his eyes found Rachel, standing upright beside me with one hand resting lightly on the back of a nearby chair, and every trace of color drained straight out of his face. The pen in his hand hit the table and rolled off the edge onto the carpet. "Rachel," he said, his voice cracking wide open. "What? How are you?" Rachel didn't raise her voice. She crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, and lowered herself into the empty chair directly across from him. I stood behind her shoulder, arms crossed. The sales training in Charlotte was a nice touch, Derek, Rachel said, her tone calm and level. Except, Macon County posts every pending deed transfer to their public records site the moment the title search clears. The agent looked between them, her pen frozen above the paperwork. Is there something I should know here? Sir, is this your wife? I can explain, Derek said, his hands coming up off the table, palms out. Rachel, honey, you're not supposed to be out of the house. You're supposed to be resting. Did you take your... My legs are fine, Derek, Rachel said. And my head hasn't been this clear in 3 years. She reached into the tote bag and set the folder gently on top of the closing documents already spread across the table. In here you'll find 3 years of infusion billing records for a compound that was never prescribed by any physician on my care team. Bank records showing $160,000 withdrawn from a court-supervised trust using a forged power of attorney amendment, and a revocation of that power of attorney that my attorney filed with the county clerk this morning. The older gentleman handling the paperwork slowly slid his own pen down onto the table and folded his hands. Sir, ma'am, if there's a dispute over the source of these closing funds, we're going to need to pause everything right here. It's my money, Derek snapped, his composure finally splitting down the center. I've spent 3 years managing every single part of her care while you sat there in that chair doing nothing, Rachel. Nothing. I gave up my Saturdays. I gave up. You didn't manage my care, Rachel said, and her voice didn't rise even a little, which somehow made it land harder than shouting ever could. You managed my dependence. There's a difference, and I finally understand it. Derek reached for the folder like he might grab it off the table, and the older man immediately placed his own hand flat over it. I wouldn't do that, sir. Derek's jaw worked, and he looked from Rachel to me and back again, something desperate flickering behind his eyes. This is insane. You're going to believe some folder over your own husband? I've been by her side for 8 years. You've been standing over her for 8 years, I said, keeping my voice low and even. There's a difference, too. Rachel reached forward and slid the closing contract gently out from under his hand. She didn't tear it. She folded it neatly in half and passed it back to the agent. This closing is done, Rachel said. And by now the funds sitting in your escrow account should already be frozen. My attorney filed a fraud hold with the bank this morning before we left the house. Derek sat frozen for a moment, then shoved back from the table so hard his chair nearly toppled. You have no idea what you're throwing away, he said to Rachel, his voice climbing. I could have left. I could have walked away from all of it the day they told us you might never walk again. And I stayed. You stayed because I was worth $11,000 a month to you as long as I couldn't stand up, Rachel said quietly. That's not staying. That's an investment. The older gentleman stood up, buttoning his jacket, and looked at Derek with plain, quiet disgust. I think it's time you left the premises, sir, before I call the sheriff's office myself. Derek's eyes swept the room one last time, landing on Rachel, who met his gaze without flinching. Something in his face gave way, not remorse, just the recognition that the room had already turned against him. He snatched his coat off the back of his chair and stormed out through the front door, the little brass bell clattering hard against the glass behind him. We followed a few minutes later, out into the cold mountain air. As I pulled the truck out of the lot, I watched Derek in the rearview mirror, pacing near his SUV with his phone pressed to his ear, one hand raking through his hair. He called my cell phone at 11:20. I let it ring out. He called again 9 minutes later. By the time we pulled into the sheriff's department parking lot in Asheville a little after noon, there were 19 missed calls sitting on my dashboard screen. I never answered a single one of them. The legal process didn't move fast. But once the truth starts moving through the right channels, it doesn't stop for anybody's convenience. Because Rachel chose not to make a scene, chose not to post about it online, chose to let the investigators do their work quietly, the case built itself brick by brick. The Financial Crimes Unit spent the better part of 4 months tracing every transfer out of that trust account. They found nearly $310,000 total, moved out through forged amendments and phantom medical invoices billed to clinics that had no record of ever treating Rachel at all. The infusion nurse, it turned out, had been paid in cash on the side to keep her questions to herself. She lost her license the following spring. In February, Derek accepted a plea deal to avoid trial on charges of financial exploitation of a disabled adult and forgery. He agreed to full restitution through wage garnishment, forfeiture of any remaining claim to the marital home, and 5 years of probation. He didn't apologize at the final hearing. He sat at the defense table, staring straight ahead at the wall behind the judge, his jaw tight, looking like a man who still believed, somewhere underneath it all, that he'd simply gotten unlucky. Rachel didn't need his apology by then. She sat 2 rows back in the gallery beside me, wearing a soft green dress, her cane resting against the bench next to her. She watched him the way you'd watch weather passing on the other side of a window, something that used to matter enormously and didn't anymore. Late that spring, we held a small cookout in the backyard of the house on Chestnut Ridge Road, the one Rachel kept in the settlement. Miss Odell's grandson came by with a crowbar and spent an afternoon pulling up the old wheelchair ramp along the side door, stacking the weathered boards by the fence one at a time. When the last board came free, he stood up, dusted off his jeans, and looked over at Rachel, who was standing near the grill flipping corn with a pair of tongs, steady on her feet. "Gonna miss having a reason to come fix that thing," he said, grinning. "You can come fix something else instead," Rachel said, laughing, and handed him a paper plate. Rachel went back to teaching that fall, part-time at first, then full-time by the following spring. She still walks with a hitch in her left leg, more noticeable on cold mornings when the fog sits low in the valley, the way it did that first day she stood up in the kitchen. She doesn't talk about those years with bitterness. When it comes up, she just says she's grateful she finally learned to trust the sound of her own footsteps again. Sitting on that back porch last spring, watching her plant tomatoes along the fence line by herself, no chair, no cane within reach, I understood something I wish I'd understood 8 years earlier. Real strength isn't loud. It isn't slamming doors or making a scene in front of an audience. Real strength is standing up quietly, walking away from the person who's been keeping you small, and letting the truth carry the weight you spent years carrying alone. I spent 8 years believing I'd failed my daughter simply by not being able to stop that accident from happening. But the morning she walked into my kitchen on her own 2 feet was the morning I finally understood we both got free that day, not just her. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Rachel's story. If it reminded you to look a little closer at the people around someone you love, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what stuck with you most. Take care of the people who can't always speak up for themselves, and I'll see you in the next one.